My name is Tom and I'm from Sacramento, California. Years ago, my dad and I took an overnight fishing trip to a lake called Ice House Reservoir in the Crystal Basin Recreation Area. We drove his truck and camper up in the morning and were only staying until the next day. We have done countless trips like this since I was a kid, so it's something we were used to doing. In the early afternoon, we were bank fishing about a quarter-mile east of the Strawberry Point campground under perfectly clear skies. While we were down there, both of us looked up at the same time because we heard this sound coming from behind us. A good comparison of this might be when you hear a helicopter in the distance and you can tell it's getting closer. It had that same feeling to it, but it didn't sound like a helicopter. It was actually like two different sounds on top of each other at the same time. There was a lower bass sound that you could feel, then also a higher sound mixed in with that, but the higher one seemed to fade out as it got closer to us. We put our stuff down and started walking the shoreline, trying to look up at the sky to see what was coming. I expected something to fly over the trees at any second, and I remember wondering if it was a fire helicopter, but there weren't any fires that we knew of and we didn't see smoke in any direction. We walked around for a minute and could not figure out where it was coming from. It continued to get louder too, and I could have sworn it was directly above us, or at least very close, but we didn't see anything. My dad and I kept saying to each other how weird it was to hear something like that in broad daylight without being able to see what it was. Whatever we were hearing was loud. Then it sort of wound down and made this noise like an engine slowing down, but on a larger scale. It's hard to put it into words, but think of a huge jet engine shutting off. After that, it was quiet again, and we had no idea what had just happened. We never saw a thing in any direction. I remember walking with my dad back to where our stuff was, and we were talking to each other, but it didn't even dawn on me that it was getting dark out. Without even mentioning that, we picked everything up and started walking back to the campground with our gear. For some reason, it was much later in the day without any transition into that evening. I also felt different on the walk back, where everything seemed like a dream to me. I've only smoked weed a few times in my life because I never really liked it, but it reminded me of that feeling. I had this mild detachment or dissociation from reality, and along with that, everything around me looked warmer, almost like I was wearing sunglasses with very subtle yellow lenses. It's hard for me to explain, but basically I didn't feel right. When we got back to the truck, it was after 8 p.m. and that should have been a big red flag since we had started fishing around 2 in the afternoon. I don't know why, but this didn't really register with either one of us, and we just put our stuff away and got ready for bed. What's almost crazier than that is the fact that we skipped dinner. We had packed steaks and potatoes specifically to cook that night and didn't even take it out of the fridge. Normally, we would make dinner and stay up for a while before going to bed, but that night we did nothing and went to sleep around 9 o'clock, which was so unusual. It's hard for me to believe we didn't question that when I think about it. We were just like robots on autopilot that night. In the morning, we had some coffee while we packed up, but still didn't make anything for breakfast, and we left the campground before 10 a.m. After that trip, not a word was spoken about it for 2 years. It just blended in with all of our other fishing trips, and I don't know why. Then one day, my dad asked me out of the blue if I remembered what happened up at Ice House Lake. Just him mentioning the trip made it come back to me, but it wasn't like I had forgotten. It was more like something I hadn't thought about in a long time. I told him I did remember and let him know that that trip didn't make sense to me. That kicked off a 20-minute conversation between us, and during that conversation, we both slowly realized and admitted that something happened to us that day. We remembered fishing and hearing that huge sound, but neither one of us had anything between about 2:30 and 8:30 p.m. when we walked back to the truck. When we really thought about it, there were 6 hours that we couldn't account for, and we had no explanation for it. We also agreed it was way out of character for us to skip dinner and go to bed like we did. That part really gets to me because we love cooking and having a beer together after a day of fishing, and that was not normal behavior. The conversation with my dad bothered me for a good 6 months, and I thought about it so many times. Then, in a right place, right time moment, a friend of mine heard the story and suggested hypnotherapy. I didn't take that recommendation seriously at first, but after a few more months, I decided to give it a shot. I actually ended up doing 3 sessions with the guy I found, and from the minute I shook his hand, I made it clear to him that I was a skeptic and I was only doing it because a close friend of mine said it might help to refresh my memory. Here's the thing, technically I was right. I didn't get any new information through hypnotherapy. It did help me visualize things that I already knew, but there was no aha moment where I figured out what happened. What did come out of it though was a rock-solid confirmation that I was missing 6 hours of that day. I am absolutely positive we started fishing with bright overhead sun, so I knew it was early in the afternoon. Then after my dad and I had heard that sound, we walked back to the campground and the sun was almost down. There was nothing in between those 2 memories. So in that sense, I think the hypnotherapy worked really well. I know for a fact that my dad and I didn't stand there on the shore fishing for 6 straight hours in the sun without realizing it. At the very least, we would have had sunburns, which we didn't. My hypnotherapy sessions brought me to the internet, and asking questions online brought me into the world of close encounters and abductions. The more I would read from other people, the more uncomfortable it made me because of how many details were the same. We heard something in the air over the lake even though the sky was empty. Then we had a significant amount of time disappear right afterward. That alone is pretty convincing to me. But what seals the deal personally is the dreamlike state we were in for the rest of the night. My dad and I would never act like that unless something was seriously wrong. I laid this theory out in depth to my dad one time, but he's a deeply Christian man and doesn't believe any of it, especially when I talked about abductions. He won't even entertain the possibility of that being a real thing. It's never caused any problems between us. We just see what happened in 2 completely different ways. I will admit all day long that I don't know what it was, but I think there's a strong possibility we had a real close encounter. I was about 8 years old and my parents and I were staying at a KOA campground in Montana in our travel trailer. There was a full bedroom in the back with a curtain for my parents, then the bathroom and kitchen were in the middle, and the dinette on the other end converted into a bed for me and our dog. I don't know what time it was, but on one of the nights I woke up from hearing our dog whining at the door like he needed to go out. I got out of bed and put his leash on, then stood with him just a few feet away from the camper door so he could go to the bathroom. While I was waiting for him, I started to look around the campground and saw something so weird. The way I remember it is that it looked like a big group of people walking toward me and they all had bright flashlights. I couldn't actually see people. All I could really see were the beams of light pointing and moving in different directions. I want to say there were 20 or 30 of them in total. Each one seemed to be moving on its own, that's why I thought it was people, but the group as a whole was coming toward me. I don't think I was scared, but I did want to get back inside, and I know I was tugging on the leash. Then our dog started pulling hard away from me and was able to drag my little 50-pound body past the picnic table and onto the campground road toward this group of lights. After fighting with him to come back, I'm not really sure what happened, but I went somewhere else and I always feel weird talking about this. Without any transition, I was in a room and sitting on something that I would call a princess bed. It was like a small single bed with a taller decorative headboard and a pink blanket on it. There weren't any windows or any other furniture. There was only a door that was open, and I remember seeing 2 very strange-looking people at the doorway that seemed to be talking to each other. There was more light outside the room than inside, and that was partially silhouetting them, but I got a very quick glance at one of them when it looked toward me, and it was so incredibly scary. The face I saw looked like a disfigured person with shiny, smooth skin, and the eyes had no white or color in them. They were like empty holes. I stood up on the bed and moved backward until my back hit the wall, and it made a lot of noise. Both of these people at the door looked at me, and I not only got a clearer view of them, but the one on the right opened its mouth and made a sound that I have never heard before or forgotten. I have even had nightmares about it. The sound was a little bit like a large frog or toad croaking, only it was slower and went on for longer. That's actually what I thought they were at that age, weird frog people. It was absolutely terrifying, and whatever came out of its mouth was one of the most distinct sounds I've ever heard. It scared me so badly that I dropped back down on the bed and pulled the blanket around my face. I couldn't see them after that, but I felt their hands around both of my arms like they were trying to lay me back down, and I started to violently flail around. Then it was like I woke myself up because I was instantaneously back in the camper and in bed. My dog was next to me too and seemed totally fine. I ended up running back to my parents' bed, and my mom still remembers this because I slept with them for the rest of that trip. I was always told by my mom that this was a bad dream, but my dad did have to clean up a pile from the dog the next morning that was right outside the camper door. He even got on me a little for leaving it there, so that tells me I did go outside. I questioned all of this for years. It was like this little thing in the back of my mind that I would think about once in a while, and I could never be at peace with it. When I was in my early 20s, I was watching a Nat Geo special with an ex-boyfriend while we were in a hotel and visiting his parents. The show was going through a bunch of different animals in Africa, and there was a part about monkeys. One of the monkeys they talked about was the colobus monkey, and they showed one sitting in a tree in the forest. Then they played a perfect recording of it making one of its calls. The instant I heard this sound, it triggered something I have never felt before. A rush of panic went through me, and I had to turn the channel in the middle of the show. I was actually tearing up from a monkey call, and my boyfriend thought something was wrong with me. The slow, deep croaking sound that a colobus monkey makes is identical to what I heard during my camping experience. It's not similar or close to it, it is exactly the same. I tried explaining myself, but my ex had never heard the story about what happened when I was a kid, so I'm sure it didn't make a lot of sense to him. I hadn't even thought about it in years before the Nat Geo show, but when I heard that sound, it brought it back hard, and really it's what made me start to think about it differently. In my opinion, there was no way a sound from a dream could have hit me that deeply. After spending some time trying to understand what actually happened, I am certain I got up that night in the camper and took the dog out. That is a real memory, not a dream. Past that though, I'm not sure what the group of lights were that I saw, or how I got into a completely different place. What I really don't understand are the two weird-looking people I saw in the room. I thought of them as frog people when I was little, but they didn't actually look like frogs. I just went with that because of their skin and the sound I heard. I can still picture the one opening its mouth, and it was like a human mouth, but without the lips. They both seem very alien to me now, and I've really leaned in that direction over the past 5 years or so. It's hard for me to say that I possibly had an alien encounter or even an abduction in the middle of a crowded campground right in the summer, but that is where I'm at. I know something happened to me and it affected me my entire life. Even hearing frogs now reminds me of it because it's so similar, but I can definitely say that I will never listen to a colobus monkey again, not on purpose anyway. I am from northern Michigan and grew up on a lake. Our house was old and always needed an update from the dimly lit maze of wood paneling that dominated the interior, but it was a really good place to live as a kid. In the winter when I was 14 years old, there was a night when I stayed home by myself while my parents went out and they were supposed to be gone until 11 o'clock. I had no other plans beyond watching TV until they got back, so after I had dinner I was doing just that and Star Trek: The Next Generation happened to be on. On the right side of our living room we had these big bay-style windows that looked out at the lake. At night when the lights were on inside, those windows acted like mirrors and all you could see was your own reflection, but from outside you could see into the house perfectly. During one of the commercial breaks, I got up to go into the kitchen, and while I was in there, I heard a crack like something hitting one of those big windows. I remember the sound very clearly, and it had a sharpness to it like the actual window frame or glass was cracking or popping. That house made noises all the time, so it didn't concern me too much. I did put my face and hands on the glass to look past the reflection, but I didn't see anything. When the show was on again, I was back on the couch, and maybe a minute into it, I heard the same crack at the window again. Since I was in the living room, I heard it perfectly that time, and it definitely didn't sound like the normal creaking of the house. It was a loud pop, like the whole window frame was being compressed. I got an immediate feeling of paranoia and pictured someone prying on it from the outside to get in. I got up and went to our laundry room because the small window in there had a different angle of the yard. That room was also darker, so there was no reflection and I could see outside. I looked around the whole yard and the small amount of snow on the ground made it a little easier to see. Then I saw something move across part of our yard. I had no idea if it was a person or an animal, and I didn't care. I was young and home alone, so my adrenaline exploded. I left the lights and the TV on in the living room and ran straight into my bedroom, then grabbed the chair at my desk and put the back of it under the doorknob like a makeshift lock. Looking back, that was totally useless, but I was terrified someone was going to get in. My room had 2 windows that were barely covered by these thin decorative side curtains, so I felt like I was on display in there. I turned off the lights, then crawled across the floor to stay away from the windows and pulled myself under the bed. I also grabbed my sleeping bag out of the closet and slid plastic tubs of Legos in front of me to block the gap under the bed like a barricade. Once that was covered, I got into the sleeping bag and didn't know what to do. I probably should have called the police, I just wasn't thinking about it in the moment. I couldn't leave my room after that either, and the only phones in the house were in the kitchen and my parents' room. In the middle of the chaos, I heard a deep humming that was getting progressively stronger. It got to the point where parts of the house were vibrating from it. I could even feel it through the floor and on the wall under my bed. It almost sounded like there was a train going by outside the house. I did feel a little bit safer under the bed, but also a little trapped too. All I could do was imagine some big guy walking in and finding me. Then the vibrating just stopped, and at the same time, the lights in our hallway went out and popped like the bulbs blew. Right after that happened, I saw blue lights outside that looked a lot like police lights without the red. They were flashing and strobing brightly enough that I could see them through the plastic bins, and it actually gave me a little relief, like someone was there to help. The weirdest part about this, and it's something I didn't think about until later, was that my windows faced the lake. The road and our driveway were on the opposite side of the house, so whatever was making the blue lights had to have come from the lakeside. I remember zipping up the sleeping bag all the way, and I slid to the very bottom of it so my head was covered. I was also holding the top closed and praying for my parents to get home. This is when the most confusing thing happened. From my perspective, I was tucked into my sleeping bag for a few minutes at the most. It had to have been less than 5. Then, like my prayers had been answered, my mom came walking into my room, casually saying my name. The chair in front of the door did nothing but slide across the floor, so she easily walked right in. When I finally came out from under my bed, I spent a lot of time trying to explain the situation. At that same time, my dad was walking around the house asking about the power going out because some of our light switches still weren't working. What blew my mind though was that they came home when they said they'd be home, 11 o'clock. That's what time it was, and no matter how I tried to calculate it, I should have had a couple more hours left by myself. Star Trek hadn't even ended when I ran into my room, so I know it was earlier than 11, and this was back when it was still on TV. The entire night had confused and exhausted me. In the morning, my dad had to change out almost half the light bulbs throughout our house, and both of our alarm clocks needed to be reset, so we had definitely lost power. His idea was that a power surge had caused the outage and made the bulbs blow, and it was possibly related to the snow and ice. He also thought the blue lights I'd seen were most likely from a police car or utility trucks driving by to address the problem. Something definitely happened, and it caused a major electrical event at our house. If it weren't for the other things I experienced, I would happily believe it was a transformer or a downed line, but I saw something or someone in our backyard, and I couldn't even guess what caused the massive vibrations I felt. My loss of time would also need to be addressed because I couldn't have just fallen asleep with that much adrenaline. Finally, I never heard a word about any of our neighbors losing power, so as far as I know, we were the only ones, and that just seems a little too impossible. Part of me wishes I would have looked outside when I saw the lights, but I just didn't have the guts to do it. That frustrates me now because if I had, I might have been able to figure out what actually happened.